My name is Dave Jensen. I'm Whiskey 7 Delta Golf Juliet. You'll find me operating sideband on 40, 20, 17, a lot of CW on 20 meters, and I've been a ham for quite a while, but also had a period of my life where I was not a ham. And that period of time just sort of went by the boards. I don't know, girls and cars and all that stuff, and just sort of lost track of my hobby. Came back to it in the pandemic, like a lot of folks, and it's been wonderful since then. I write a column for QRZ. It's called Trials and Errors. It's a product review column. It's an editorial column. When one of the guys from QRZ said, "Hey, how'd you like to write something for us?" I said, "What about?" "Oh, just your opinion." Now, I love that. Just imagine a ham radio operator with an opinion. Can you imagine that? It's an amazing thing. We have so many opinions. In fact, the only thing that's very frustrating about writing that column is the fact that I have an open forum attached to every one of the articles where people can come in and gripe about the comments from the opinion writer. So, who am I? That's my first topic, briefly. Innovators and innovation. I'm going to talk about what the difference is between an inventor and an innovator, because there's a big difference. We'll talk about mindsets and traits of the innovator, and then building on the radio art and where new radio technologies might come from in the future. First of all, who am I? I'm a guy who was a radio operator, as I said, for a long time, but during that period of time where I wasn't operating radios, I was a headhunter. And a headhunter is someone who's a talent scout, right? That's basically what my job was. Talent does you no good unless you're recognized by somebody else. So my job was to go out and find talent, and the area I was working in was finding talent in innovation, in science, in engineering, and so forth. I had to recognize talent when I saw it, whether it was someone just getting graduated out of college or whether it was someone with 30 years of experience that my client wanted. We go after that person because of those particular skills that they brought to the table. This was an incident, an innovation period of time for me that brought me into the world of executive recruiting. In the late 1970s, Dr. Herbert Boyer of Stanford University had just cloned a microbe. So he had just made a copy, genetic copy of another microbe, and inserted some DNA into that microbe that wasn't from that bacteria, and it was remarkable. It was written about in all the newspapers at this dawn of biotechnology. Well, that fellow did have a pretty amazing talent, science, technical talent. One day he got an invitation for coffee with an investor, a guy by the name of Robert Swanson, and that fellow was with a venture capital company called Kleiner Perkins. After the coffee, hours later, they both invested $500 into an idea. Hey, what if there's some commercial potential that can come out of this thing called biotechnology or genetic engineering? And sure enough, now, a few years later, that $1,000 investment, that was a part of a more than $47 billion valuation when the company was acquired in 2009. So that's how fast innovation can turn into profits if you happen to be thinking about profits. Now, the point of inventors versus innovators is that not all inventors think profits. You think Joe Taylor, inventor of our digital modes, thought about making a lot of money out of his invention? Not at all. So I've written about innovation for 25 plus years in a journal called Science. And my articles there's a couple hundred of them that once a week over the course of these years, I would pop out another article for innovators about their careers and about how they should present themselves to investors and so forth. But just like you have a ham origin story, shortwave listener, loved CW in the early days. The station got a little more sophisticated as I got older. But this was a fact that I got into radio because I was right next to this industrial park called Nela Park in Cleveland, Ohio. That's where I grew up. And this place, Nela Park, was General Electric's facility for doing R&D. They had this most incredible dump behind their building. All these buildings in Newell Park would dump everything that they were working on into this big dump. And for a 10 or 12-year-old kid with a slingshot or a BB gun, going in the back and seeing piles of millions of light bulbs, that could sound like fun, wouldn't it? Well, that's what I remember about Newell Park. But my dad worked there. And my dad was a biographer for the Thomas Edison aspect of General Electric. Thomas Edison was a co-founder of General Electric Company. And Dad would tell me these unending Edison stories. I got hooked on innovation because of my dad and his writing and stories about Thomas Edison and other inventors from General Electric. General Electric had a ham radio business for a long time. I don't remember that. I'm not that old of an old timer, right? But General Electric did have tubes and other components, radios. They had scientists and engineers working on sideband. GE was an interesting business back then. This guy, I remember meeting him at General Electric. He was a sideband pioneer. Robert Dome had a great deal to do with making sideband work to replace AM radio at the time. So this is what got me started in ham radio. It doesn't look like a ham radio device, but it certainly is an interesting device. It's called a Big Ear. The Big Ear was advertised in comic books. Here's this device that you take and you can point it at a crowd of females on the corner and you can hear what they're talking about, hundreds of feet away, et cetera. Now, I thought that long-distance communication sounded really cool to be able to hear people way far away. That didn't work, of course. Neither did these X-ray specs. Okay, another comic book ad. Who needs them? Well, young boys, evidently, because you see these in all the comic books back then. In Boy's Life, a magazine ad for wireless telegraph. Now, this was a real ad, and this was a real cool device, the Telemco Complete Outfit. This was the first amateur radio sold. It was a 1-inch spark coil. You get the strap key, sender, a sensitive relay, a coherer, that's a receiver with automatic decoherer, and sounder, batteries included with necessary wiring, including the send and catch wires. Doesn't that sound interesting? All for $8.50. And back then, there were lots and lots of boys reading these magazines and saving up their paper route money and so forth to buy the Telemco Complete Outfit. Well, where'd that come from, that particular innovation? That came from a guy named Hugo Gernsback. Hugo, interesting fellow. He was the father of science fiction stories. Hugo Gernsback wrote Amazing Stories, the magazine. I think it's still around today, or at least it's one of the most popular science fiction magazines of all time. Hugo's known for having forecast an amazing number of things. Just some of his articles had projected in the future we would see microfilm, the jukebox, satellites, space flight, tape recorders, artificial cloth, television and channel surfing, the video phone, transcontinental air services, solar energy and practical use, sound movies, synthetic milk and foods, and voice printing. All these things, before they actually hit, were written about by Hugo Gernsback and his colleagues for Amazing Stories. But not every invention's a hit, right? I don't know what this did. I forget what it was called, but he wanted a place to totally focus. He wanted the ability to go into an environment where he could bring new ideas to the table. And that's, of course, what that does. But it wasn't a big hit, no. This was another one of his odd contraptions. Hugo's television that straps to the forehead. This was right off the cover of Life magazine, and they were talking about the future. Well, why we don't have anything goofy like that, we do have goggles hooked up now, to Google and other services that probably quite a bit like what Hugo was forecasting when he came up with that. So inventors are completely blue sky. They're curious, they're thinkers, they're coming up with something not because they necessarily want to sell a lot of them and make billions of dollars, but they're curious people and innovators. Gernsback was more of an innovator, I think. He would take ideas from other people and modify them and put together new and interesting uses for these ideas. So we'll talk about two different kinds of innovation, both from the pure inventor prospect and also from innovation in terms of it being separate from inventors. There's a lot more innovators in the world than there are inventors, and all of us in this room could be considered innovators when we think about designing some new antenna. You got a wild idea, you want to give it a try. I mean, that's all innovation. Famous fellow here, I had an opportunity recently to interview him. Joe Taylor, professor, came up with the digital modes, and I would say he's the kind of the guy behind all of those digital modes. Joe is a wonderful, easy to talk to person. It's been recognized in this forum in the past, Ham of the Year in 2015 or 2016. Great guy, but pure inventor. He's a guy whose research is funded by the government, and yet we benefited from it over here in the amateur radio community. So David Sarnoff describes research as the distance between an idea and its realization, and I think that's a pretty good description. This slide's going to be hard to read for the people in the back, and I'll just brush on it quickly. But a lot of innovation comes from government money being invested into research, basic research. And yet ham radio innovation seems to have been in the category of private research, where an individual or a company is building something, and that has always been the way it is here. But our hobby did benefit, as I said in that last line, a great deal from Joe Taylor's government-funded R&D, and of course he won a Nobel Prize. So an inventor is someone who makes another man rich. David Sarnoff, he came up with that quote, and he's the perfect example of a fellow who became rich because of someone else's inventions. David Sarnoff is a famous radio personality, not necessarily a personality. We think of Sarnoff as an executive, head of RCA for many years when it was a major force. And here's the exact person he's talking about, who would be someone that other people made money from, Michael Faraday. He's a physicist, an engineer, a chemist. As a chemist, the guy discovered benzene. He made the first Bunsen burner. He as a physicist, discovered so many aspects of electromagnetism, for example. In fact, his list of achievements is such that in Wikipedia, when you read about Michael Faraday, it says that he is probably the single most respected scientist internationally, globally, out of all the last couple hundred years because of the number of things that he came up with. And they were all so different. Formal education, had none, just a really smart guy. If Faraday had been an entrepreneur, if he had been a Hugo Gernsback, and he had that drive to make a buck as well as do interesting science, Margaret Thatcher said the value of his work today would be higher than the capitalization of all the shares of all the companies on the stock exchange. That's how much value his science and his new discoveries brought when you think of other people picking up those discoveries and then making money from them. Electric motors, all the things that came about as a result of Faraday's work. Here's another fellow. I would consider Marconi, even though he is known as the inventor of radio, I think he's more of an innovator. He took other people's work and made it better, made it work better. He took Heinrich Hertz's information and science about radio waves and started playing with them as a young kid. 13 years old, he started playing with radio waves. And when he was in his early 20s, he had the success of getting radio waves to move beyond one room to another in his house in Italy. He was a very well-to-do gentleman. Here's a picture of Marconi at his Signal Hill, Newfoundland station. And this is an event that took place in history. Gosh, I forgot the date. I had it in my head. But it was 1902, as I recall. 1902. Marconi's transmission was a gigantic step for mankind, according to the newspapers. And it was when Marconi sat there on this side of the water and heard his transmission take place from Cornwall, England. And the transmission consisted of one letter, 3 dots, an S. And that's what he heard, and he reported that to the newspapers, that he picked that up at 12:30 in the afternoon, and again at 1:10 in the afternoon. He heard the S being sent across the sea, and that was forecast as a major change for the world because of Marconi's invention of radio at that time. Here's a picture of David Sarnoff and Guglielmo Marconi together. Sarnoff started working for the Marconi Company. He was a Marconi man, as they called them, and that meant that he was pretty good at his code operation with his hand. And still today, or not today, but in the past, he would be shown with Morse code working right at his hand. He had a device in his office at RCA where he could send code to other people. Downstream executives in the company would pick up his messages coming in by Morse code, wired code, of course, but still, he couldn't take his hands off that key. He was an interesting individual, even though he was not the guy who was at the key during the Titanic sinking. His publicity department decided that they would make him the fellow who was at the key during the sinking of the Titanic. And while everyone knew it wasn't Sarnoff at the key reporting the Titanic disaster, it was someone else. The company publicity department made it look as if it was David Sarnoff. But he did have a remarkable innovation in terms of seeing radio as something more than point-to-point communication. Point-to-point communication is what radio had been, right? One person in one spot talking to another person in another spot. And of course, there were a variety of people that saw there could be more than that, but Sarnoff is the one who really kicked it off. There was a gigantic sporting event that took place, and that was the fight between it was a huge sporting event with $1,700,000 coming in for the Jack Dempsey, George Carpentier fight, which they built a stadium for in New Jersey. And it was interesting because they had no stadium there, so they took millions of board length of green lumber that wasn't supposed to be used in any kind of serious construction and built a sporting event, a coliseum, as we would call it today. 90,000 people packed in to watch Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier fight. Jack Dempsey was the fellow who was the reigning U.S. champion, and Carpentier was the reigning European champion. And Dempsey happened to be the underdog because the Americans all wanted the French guy to win. I know it sounds strange, but the French guy was the favored to win because he was such a gentleman and a World War hero and so forth. But he didn't. He lost. But the story is told that David Sarnoff purchased a big radio transmitter from the government, this gigantic transmitter made by General Electric for the Navy, installed it right near the huge 90,000 person Coliseum. And as he did that, he then got the Wireless Association of America, a bunch of ham radio operators, to set up receiving stations in all the different theaters and venues around the East Coast. And 300,000 people listened to that sporting event. It was the first time that radio had really moved from point-to-point transmission to mass communication. It was a broadcasting event. And oddly, right after Carpentier got knocked to the mat and the match was over, the General Electric transmitter melted down, a complete mass of metal that just disappeared because it had overheated to that point. Luckily, just a few seconds after the match ended. I love some of these books that I've been reading about radio and the history of radio. Wes Chum, Amateur Radio's Unsung Hero. 200 Meters and Down, I really like that one. The World of Ham Radio, 1901 to 1950. And Empire of the Air, which is also a broadcast on PBS. These are great books for reading about this topic. And I felt that this quote from Wes Chum described these traits pretty well. Developing anything new takes laser focus coupled with a strong desire to succeed at all costs, knowing heady obstacles and unforeseen challenges await. I call that first thread laser focus. So here's a modern day innovator, Martin Jew from MFJ. Martin is interviewed in the column Trials and Errors. Martin is interviewed and talks about some of the experiences he had. He was such a young man and working out of a rented motel room to build his company. He knew that he was going to have a huge company. He knew that it was going to be making a major impact in ham radio because there was no one doing what he was going to do. And so he had that focus, and he built that organization despite a lot of very big setbacks. He was working one day in his lab bench in the motel room, and he was developing a circuit that he was hoping was going to be some kind of tool for ham radio operators. It didn't do what it was supposed to do, and instead that circuit allowed him to test the SWR of an antenna. Lo and behold, he came up with an antenna analyzer, and that whole market was developed as a result of that Sunday afternoon he spent in the laboratory. So you have to be adaptable if you're a ham innovator. You have to be adaptable. I love the quote from Henry Adams, "The law of nature is change and chaos, while the dream of man is order." I show that little bird because it's a good example. It reminds me of how suddenly sideband is here and wipes out AM radio. Well, AM radio is still there, of course, and a lot of people love it. But sideband came in, the technology was there was momentum, there were developments, and it quickly replaced AM radio over a period of years. This bird is called the Shepherd's Island wren, and there's this little rocky point, this little island off of New Zealand, and that little island has some unusual wildlife on it, but they persisted. They lived there for centuries because man did not live on Shepherd's Island. It was too rocky. All these ships kept crashing on Shepherd's Island. And so these little wrens, little flightless birds, no bigger than a small mouse, lived and were happy ever after until they built a lighthouse on Shepherd's Island. And when they built a lighthouse, they needed a lighthouse keeper, right? Well, what's a lighthouse keeper going to do if he doesn't have a companion animal? So they brought on Mrs. Tibbles. Mrs. Tibbles was a cat. And within the course of a few years, the entire population of Shepherd's Island wren went extinct, all due to that one cat. That's how nature works. Here's another common thread that I've identified over the course of talking to innovators, and that's long-range vision. The 90% of the revenues our firm derives on the last day of the year are attributable to products that didn't even exist on the first day of the same year. That's from the IT business, the chip business. Can you imagine that? You don't know today what you're going to be selling a year from now. You're developing it. It's in the lab. It's in research. It's being innovated. But 90% of their profits come from those new products that they developed on that same year. Amazing. We call foresight the ability to see how innovation proceeds in order to make an impact. If you look ahead, you can see what that innovation might be able to do in the marketplace. If you don't look ahead, if you're just pushing the technology, what happens is like pushing that cart. And instead, I would say that most successful entrepreneurs use what's called a market pull approach. They figure out what they've developed, they find out what the market needs. What do ham radio operators need? This guy right here, he's a tremendous fellow. If you ever have a chance to chat with him or look at his business, KM3KM makes linear power amplifiers. Great products. Okay, a lot of power amplifiers out there. So what did he do? He came from Cuba as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy. He knew he wanted to be in electronics, so he took classes, read books, etc., and he decided he would build a company that makes linear power amplifiers. And he set his sights on making the best linear power amplifier that could be made for the money, and giving ham radio operators a value and giving them some very unusual things, like, for example, well, no matter who owns it, no matter how far past warranty it is, you send it in here, I'll fix it for free, I'll just charge you for parts. You know, that kind of warranty, that kind of service, the ability to reach them when you have a problem, all these things Kenny came up with because he decided that this is what we need to do if we're going to actually sell products. We're not just going to have a cool amplifier. We want to give hams what they need. So that's another fellow interviewed in the pages of Trials and Errors on QRZ. I'd like to, when I was doing a lot of recruiting work, I'm retired now, but when I was doing a lot of recruiting work, I noticed that sometimes people who were innovators, inventors, they would have a particular personality style. They would either be comfortable with self-promotion, or they would be very quiet, inward, shy people that didn't know much about that. And I think that one of the things that you find when you look at the different innovators who have affected ham radio is that some of them have been very outrageously self-promotion able. They're good at that. David Sarnoff, wonderful ability to self-promote, move his way up in an organization, right? Other people, Mr. Armstrong, who developed so much of our superheterodyne and improved the Audion tubes and so forth, FM radio, he just could not self-promote. He had patents, he had the ability, but he just was not a self-promoter. And I don't think you necessarily need to be a Sarnoff. It's just that it is a difference between people. Some of these personalities are off the charts, and some are just quietly competent. Personally, what I would like to have is a person who's quietly competent, but who can express what it is that this thing that he or she has invented will actually do for you. So even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. That's a great quote. This fellow was on the right track, but unfortunately he didn't go anywhere with it. Milan Loomis was a dentist from Washington, D.C., and he launched a kite with copper mesh on it on one mountaintop and had his colleagues do the same thing 18 miles away on another mountaintop. They got the kites up in the sky with a thin wire copper filament that goes down to the ground. He had a galvanometer, and he did something with the current on one side, and it was noticed on the other side 18 miles away. It was the first radio, quote unquote, broadcast. It wasn't necessarily a tone or a CW or a voice, but it was the first radio, and he didn't promote it well. He just sat on it. He tried to get the government to buy in and help him out, but 20 years went by before he passed away, and other people got better patents. But he was there early on. Even Marconi was only a 10 or 12, 13-year-old boy at the time that Loomis was doing this work. Temperament and stamina. Well, success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. For sure, that's an important element. Failure is never final. It's the courage to continue that counts. And one of the things that Edison had in his favor was that he was a persistent guy, that's for sure. My dad would always tell me this story whenever it looked as if I was going to give up on something. You know, it took thousands of attempts to find the right filament for the light bulb. So, you know, the reporters would look at it in a sour way, you know, but Edison would come back and say, no, it wasn't a failure. We got it done. The light bulb was simply an invention with thousands of steps. Here's a modern day inventor I interviewed recently. I'm going to have an article about this fellow in my column in the very near future, Eric Anderson. He's with the company PrepCom. He is the founder and chief scientist at PrepCom. And Eric is one of the nicest people I've ever met. He's a fellow who has a temperament that stems from his great belief in God. And he simply just opens himself up to new ideas, and they come to him. He came up with the technology in every one of our cell phones. When you're taking pictures with a digital camera, a lot of those patents are held by Eric. So people like that, when they have that remarkable ability to just pull ideas out of the ether, everyone has a different way they thank God for that, but he has a very vocal way of doing it. Willingness to break the status quo is my final one, and I would say that willingness to break willingness to break the status quo is similar to like not being afraid to look stupid, and that's another way of saying it. And these inventors, like Marconi, for example, at the time that Marconi was publishing his results of having radio transmit from one point to another, a famous physicist, the guy had already been given the Sir title in England, Sir Oliver Lodge, came on to the scientific podium and said, radio waves are a unique phenomenon, but they will never be transmitted over 1/2 a mile. And sure enough, Marconi's limit on his system initially was just 1/2 a mile. A lot of people would have given up. I mean, this fellow is an eminent physicist, a Sir, and he forecast that Marconi would never do it. But of course, Marconi hung in there and managed to keep building on it. So in the future, as we look at radio art, where's it going to come from? I love this comment from Sarnoff before his death. He said, I began my career as a wireless amateur. After 43 years, I do not mind confessing that I'm still an amateur. Despite many great achievements in the science of radio and electronics, what we know today is far less than what we still have to learn. And that was David Sarnoff before his death. Bell Laboratories, a lot of great technologies came out of Bell Laboratories. The transistor, for example, gradually downsized until the remainder was sold to a French firm. So where does radio innovation come from in the future? When you look at companies and find out what they do when there's a pinch, where's the first place they cut? The first place they cut is R&D. Sadly, I mean, as a headhunter, I'm equally acquainted with people who have been let go from companies, and those individuals were always in the R&D category. They always cut that first. But the future is really in your hands because, as I said, every ham has the potential within to be an innovator. You could start a company. Here's a friend of mine, W3FF. Great guy, started Buddy Poll. I'm sure you've met him or have seen him around meetings like this. You could start your own company, or like George Senti and Collins Radio. George was the guy that came up with on his garage workbench, not at work, just playing around in his garage. And Art Collins happened to like it, so they brought it on inside the company, and it became the predecessor to their biggest selling product line of radios. So it's very possible to, even outside of companies, to be an innovator in ham radio. This probably describes my innovation ability. One who does precision guesswork based on unreliable data provided by those with questionable knowledge. That happens to be a great quote on a T-shirt of mine. A good example of why hams are incredibly persistent and smart is the story about Cape Disappointment. There was a gigantic storm. This Cape Disappointment is up, I think it's off the Oregon coast. It was a gigantic storm, and this was about 1936. And the operator of that lighthouse was concerned that things were not looking good. The rocks that the lighthouse were mounted on were shearing away. There were huge boulders of 50 and 100 pounds that were being blown in. They extinguished the light. Now, when a light goes out in a lighthouse at a rocky point, you know that there could be some lives in trouble out there on the ocean. These winds were 108 miles per hour. Well, the operator at that time, W9GIZ, I believe was his call sign. He was a fellow who decided he was going to take it into his own hands. The telephone didn't work any longer, so he took it apart. He cannibalized an old Atwater Kent receiver that he had sitting there in the lighthouse. He took bits of wax paper, aluminum foil. He took a brass doorknob. He made a key out of a spring of some kind, and he got a signal out by code to the coast to tell them that the lighthouse was down. And it saved lives that night. So that's the kind of innovation that ham radio operators are capable of. Now, my last slide, as I give you this quote, I want you to think about who's saying this. This is a 13-year-old boy saying this to Congress. The next quote comes from a young guy who was testifying to Congress at a time when we were thinking as a government of shutting off all amateurs. Amateurs were getting in the way, right? It was a time when amateur radio was interfering with wartime and interfering with Navy operations and so forth. So they invited a young boy to come in who was representing other boys. And I just think his quote is wonderful. He says, "There are vast possibilities, great discoveries, and marvelous inventions yet to be discovered in radio communications. We boys want to try the great rewards that are to come to the successful experimenters. Wireless is not mere play for us boys, as some seem to think. We love this field, and it is always the amateur, the lover of a line of work, who produces results." Well, that was a moving speech that he gave, and the legislation was not passed. So luckily, we have a hobby as we do today. Just as I close, I want to mention that QRZ, everybody uses QRZ, but you wouldn't think of it as a source of necessarily magazine-like content. But QRZ reaches 800,000 regular users. If you took QST and CQ and combined them, it would be about 1/4 of that number. There's a huge potential. If you happen to be the kind of person that likes to write about ham radio, you need to write me. My business cards are on the back, and I'm kind of working as an editor to take these articles that come in. We'll pay you the same paltry amount you're going to get from QST or CQ. You'll get an opportunity to reach 4 times the audience by writing and being published in QRZ. And every one of those articles will go through an editorial advisory board of 3 top hams. So I want to thank you very much for being here today. Last talk of the afternoon on a Saturday. That's a tough slot for any speaker, for sure. Thank you very much. There's my email address and phone number if anyone had anything they wanted to write me about afterwards. Were there any questions about any of my content or anything I can tell you about the QRZ, for example? Okay, so what topics are we covering? So what we're going to do is we're going to, right now the column, when you go to the front page of QRZ, you'll see a picture of me dressed up like a radio innovator of the old days. It's sort of a strange picture. We're going to get rid of that picture because it's not focused on me anymore. It's going to be focused on ham radio operators who are submitting articles. And so that's going to happen. And we're going to focus on antennas. We're going to focus on how-to projects. We're going to focus on all the major subsectors. We probably won't get down into the Earth to Moon kind of stuff and some of the more rare specialty areas until we've gotten our feet wet on this whole process. But if you've got something that you've done that would be of interest to other hams, then we want to know about it. That's for sure. Thanks for asking.